The statesman who had guaranteed the citizens of America over 200 times that he held the ultimate evidence was now being dared to expose just one shred of it. Merely one. The tension in the auditorium morphed noticeably before he could even frame a response. Adam Schiff had glanced at his timepiece for the fourth instance in 90 seconds, and the attendees in the foremost rows started to observe it. Similar to how one becomes aware of a ticking clock in a perfectly quiet room. J.D. Vance was seated just 4 feet across from him, wearing a subtle dark suit, with his hands positioned peacefully upon his knees. It was the demeanor of an individual who had recognized long ago that the person monopolizing the dialogue is not always the one prevailing in the dispute. Perched upon Vance's knee was a single sheet of paper, creased in half and positioned face down. He had not even brushed it with his fingers. He permitted the quietness to extend just a split second past what felt natural, and then dragged it a fraction longer. Upon finally speaking, his tone was deep and almost soothing, piercing through a chamber that had seemingly ceased to inhale. "You dedicated 2 full years promising this country that you had laid eyes on something," he declared. "Tonight, I am merely requesting that you exhibit a solitary fraction of it." Adam Schiff, a man who had forged his entire public career on always possessing the flawless rebuttal primed and ready, abruptly discovered he was completely bereft of words. To properly understand how a lawmaker who embodied the declaration, "I have seen the evidence," utterly surrendered command of a venue to a single creased page he never once had to physically touch, you must rewind approximately half an hour. You must return to the instance when he still authentically thought he was the most intelligent, most careful person on that platform. The discussion was officially designated Restoring Public Trust, and a trio of major broadcasting networks had routed heavy wires along the back boundary of Dirksen G50. That night, their recording indicators radiated a continuous red because whispers had spread that the coordinators had purposefully scheduled both figures for the exact same forum. The hall was crowded far beyond its maximum capacity. Down in the premier row rested a robust man in his 60s, his spectacles pushed up onto his brow. He had journeyed all the way from Pennsylvania earlier that day. This was a citizen whose own child had previously endured 18 months and depleted most of a pension account, shielding himself from an allegation founded on purported evidence that was never truly presented. He was not present for the political spectacle. He took the trip because he wanted, for a single occasion, to occupy a space where somebody finally posed the glaring inquiry audibly. He rested with his hands tidily intertwined, anticipating. The host provided her welcoming remarks with a cordial, extensively rehearsed polish. When the opportunity was passed to Schiff to present his initial reflections concerning honesty and the soundness of national institutions, he grasped the mic in his customary fashion, like an individual asserting dominion over an object that was already legally his. "I will speak with total frankness, as frankness is supposedly the objective of this gathering," he commenced, a narrow, deeply premeditated grin appearing on his face. "I peer across this platform, and I behold an individual who is, I am sorry to express it so directly, fundamentally clueless regarding how the gears of truth truly function in this democracy. A Marine who served a short duration as a media relations author, who came back to produce a bleak, highly commercialized autobiography regarding his own neighborhood. An individual who leveraged the momentum of that misfortune all the way to Yale, and who has somehow persuaded himself that this path transforms him into an authority on proof, on democratic frameworks, on the exact workings of the legal apparatus." A freezing hum moved across the crowd, stopping just shy of a gasp. "And the populace who cheer for him deserve a degree of truthfulness too," Schiff proceeded. "The populations who decline to analyze beyond the front pages, who willingly consume whatever storyline confirms their existing complaints, who confuse a passing sentiment with an established reality. They have been deceived into thinking that thorough individuals such as myself are the true liars, and that a man who has never once in his whole life been obligated to officially authenticate a single assertion is the genuine paragon of truth. I have committed my entire occupational existence to being precise. I have utilized my career proclaiming solely what I have physically observed." He would not even comprehend where to begin. Schiff reclined into his seat, appearing profoundly content. He looked down at his timepiece, utterly oblivious that he had just supplied the Marine sitting across from him the precise armament he needed. J.D. Vance did not outwardly respond to the onslaught of insults. He had endured worse criticism from vastly superior individuals in significantly more antagonistic settings. He merely let the surge of clapping that Schiff had obviously expected to land awkwardly hollow, allowing it to faintly ripple along one flank of the room and dissolve completely before arriving at the other side. Subsequently, he leaned toward his own mic. The initial action he took was to convey his appreciation. "I appreciate you articulating that, Senator." "I truly do," Vance remarked. "That is very likely the most beneficial declaration I anticipate hearing from you this whole night." He allowed the term beneficial to hover in the atmosphere for an extended second. "Because you just issued two distinct assertions and I completely plan to make you answerable for both of them. You declared that you are a meticulous individual, and you declared that you only ever discuss matters you have directly seen. That is a wonderful foundation to establish. Let us place that directly here in the middle of the desk where everybody in attendance can monitor it." "I would be more than willing to guide you through the subtleties of it," Schiff interrupted. "Gradually, if that simplifies it for you?" "I would be extremely grateful, sir. I genuinely would. I am a sluggish student from a sluggish region of the nation. Therefore, let us commence with something minor." Vance did not reach for any dramatic accessories. There was no storage box brimming with paperwork, no giant folder, no theatrical visual supports. There was solely the single folded document situated on his knee, and he continued to abstain from touching it. That was the signature trait of Vance that seasoned observers of Capitol Hill interrogation rooms had come to expect. He never launched an attack when you were consciously preparing for the blow. He evaluated the water's depths with a lone toe before investing his entire mass. "You declared you only express what you have observed," Vance repeated. "I wish to guarantee I possess that precisely correct, because it is vital for everything that ensues. You are the precise one. You are the defender of concrete proof. That is not me shoving vocabulary into your lips. That is the specific image you have formulated your whole public persona upon." He offered a small nod, almost radiating respect, akin to a person praising his adjacent resident's gorgeous new boundary, before notifying him it was constructed 3 feet inside the wrong property borders. "Therefore, we concur. You never appear on nationwide broadcasts and issue a declaration unless you have directly viewed the evidence. You have never, not even on a single occasion, leaped ahead of proof that you did not physically hold. Grip that foundation, Senator. Grip it extremely securely." "I have perpetually chosen my lexicon with the greatest exactness," Schiff replied, incapable of resisting the urge to respond to a query that flattered his personal vanity. "That is exactly what separates me from persons such as yourself." "Superb! That is precisely what I required to learn." And consequently, the snare clamped down its initial inch without producing a solitary noise. "Because if we review March of 2017, you appeared on nationwide television and advised the American populace that you had directly viewed, and I cite your precise phrasing, more than circumstantial evidence that the rival political operation had conspired with an adversarial overseas nation. Not there could be. Not it justifies additional probing. More than circumstantial. You asserted you had witnessed it." Vance angled his head, his disposition staying almost misleadingly courteous, and subsequently you reiterated iterations of that precise identical sentence repeatedly. "Observers have calculated it, and the tally rests significantly above 200 distinct instances, aired across every lone broadcast channel that would provide you a mic. 200 occasions you stared into a lens and informed the nation you had observed the evidence." The hall was completely silent at this point, and when the probe document that the whole country anticipated for 2 years was ultimately published, Vance proceeded, "It determined that overseas meddling was certainly a fact. It determined that communications had taken place. But concerning the lone exact accusation you definitively guaranteed us, the collusion, the massive plot, the precise element you clearly declared you had viewed, it failed to prove it. The thorough examiners who compiled that dossier could not prove the exact determination that the cautious man on broadcast had already supernaturally witnessed 200 times. He initiated a calculated break. Thus, I am not going to rest here and brand you a fabricator, Senator. I would not descend to that level. I am merely going to pose the most elementary school tier inquiry conceivable. You stated you witnessed it. Reveal to me the lone item of proof you witnessed. I am not demanding all 200. Simply grant me one. The beginning surge of amusement erupted at that moment. It was deep, unprompted, and rapid, because every single individual positioned in that hall had experienced that 2-year journalistic spectacle, and they immediately identified precisely which recurrent assertion he was citing. They recognized it without needing any extra background. And the most destructive facet of the tactic, the portion that guaranteed it pierced to the core, was the absolute humility of the petition. Schiff had not been ambushed by some complex, intensely specialized snare. He had merely been requested to supply a lone object of evidence by the exact individual he had previously waved away as too mentally inadequate to understand proof. He had promised the Republic he had viewed the evidence beyond 200 instances, and currently a former Marine was simply petitioning him to position one single piece of it onto the desk. And the allegedly precise individual abruptly had nothing to articulate. Schiff's jaw tightened noticeably firm. He had been forced into verbal dead ends previously in settings much more aggressive than this one, and he reverted to the precise maneuver he perpetually deployed whenever the ground started to collapse under his boots. He sought to alter the boundaries of the combat zone completely. He pulled his mic a centimeter nearer, and his tone recovered its booming, commanding legal depth, withdrawing to the ethical peak where he had constantly felt unassailable. "Permit me to elucidate for everybody what is genuinely occurring here this evening," he announced. He was no longer gazing at Vance. His stare was planted resolutely on the media lenses at the rear of the space, performing the traditional tactic of a lawmaker who understands the nightly broadcast clip is vastly more precious than the in-person crowd. This is the most ancient partisan strategy in being. A delegate who possessed the courage to resist against the most truly perilous leader in modern American history, a person who carried out his sworn constitutional duties while others hid under their wooden tables, is presently being metaphorically prosecuted. Prosecuted by that precise identical leader's hand-picked surrogate right here upon this platform for the unpardonable offense of being right too prematurely and too loudly. I performed my obligations. I tracked the investigatory cables wherever they unraveled. The overseas meddling was a factual reality. The unauthorized interactions were factual. And zealots like him, who would sooner fiercely assault the investigator than require justice for the foundational misdeeds, have squandered years trying to alter that past into a fabricated myth where the truth-teller is portrayed as the antagonist. I will never express regret for fiercely protecting the purity of this republic, not to him and not to anybody else. And for a passing second, you had to yield it to him. The partisan reflex was truly striking. The attendees swayed to his rhythm. It was an impeccably performed transition. He had issued that precise soliloquy 100 occasions in 100 distinct news network waiting rooms, and the rehearsed, dense seriousness of his presentation was still unbroken. A reporter's pen commenced scraping furiously across a pad. A subordinate employee sitting in the third row who had been smiling wickedly just seconds before abruptly dropped her gaze downward toward her lap. The inertia pertained to him once more, and it stayed solid. You could tangibly detect the programmed reaction moving through the hall, the inherent impulse to withdraw from the absolute magnitude and righteous fury of his speech, instead of challenging him on the fundamental defect resting underneath it. It persisted for approximately 20 seconds. It could have persisted permanently, but it was not J.D. Vance who ultimately shattered the mirage. Down at the reverse side of the extended discussion table, another individual leaned gradually toward his mic. He was a senior man with dense, aged hands and a monotone, weary rhythm to his speech. He had rested mutely throughout the entirety of the exchange, keeping his face lowered. He was a lifelong progressive. Before delving into governance, he had functioned as a federal attorney for 3 decades, and he had cast ballots strictly adhering to factional boundaries for the overwhelming majority of his vocation. I am going to utter precisely one statement, and then I will happily go back to maintaining my silence, the senior man croaked. I am a devoted Democrat. I hold absolutely zero fondness for the individual you continually indirectly cite, and I will not rest here and feign that I do. But I invested 30 years resting in tribunals where the paramount law is that you do not ever get to publicly assert you hold proof until the exact second you can lay it out upon a desk before a panel of 12 unknown citizens. That is the whole of the duty. That is the sole duty. He twisted his shoulders and fixed his gaze straight upon Schiff. Numerous of us eagerly anticipated that concluding dossier, authentically trusting you. Trusting that a high-ranking representative occupying your committee seat, holding your tier of secure access, would never carelessly state, "I have observed it," unless he genuinely possessed it. He halted, permitting the burden of the deception to linger. And when that file ultimately released, the evidence simply was not present. An individual can endure committing an error. Heavens know I have been utterly incorrect previously. But what you absolutely cannot endure, what none of our systems can endure, is being completely incorrect, and subsequently possessing the nerve to lecture the American public that it is somehow their blame for having relied on your promise in the opening place. The programmed respect immediately vanished from the chamber, and what substituted it was vastly more ruinous to Schiff. It was the sensation of authorization. The subordinate employee in the third row lifted her face, reclaiming her doubt, and this occasion she declined to glance away. You could virtually trace the awakening moving through the audience, jumping from individual to individual. It was the shared, silent realization that the impenetrable halo of command that had guarded him for seasons was nothing more than a trick. And it had eventually been challenged by the precise group it was never intended to falter against. A compatriot Democrat, a veteran professional attorney from his own partisan faction, telling him straight to his face that he had breached the most revered principle of his field, all while the conservative merely sat backward and observed it happen. Vance permitted the dense quiet to persist. He was extremely skilled at harnessing silence. He took a notably sluggish drink from his water cup and positioned it back upon the desk with a crisp, deliberate tap. For 3 agonizingly extended seconds, that crisp tap was the sole sound in the entire room. "I would have permitted the initial transgression to pass," Vance lastly remarked. "I sincerely desire you to listen to me admit that. A lawmaker becomes slightly too enthusiastic, leaps out ahead of the realities beneath the intensity of the broadcast lights. It occurs to the finest of us. I have been culpable of it myself. I once bragged to a gathering of campaign contributors that I had perused a chunk of legislation from beginning to end before the machine had even finalized producing the concluding sheets." A wave of genial, thankful amusement reverberated from Vance's segment of the chamber. Thus, I am not resting here attempting to dismantle a person's heritage over a single exaggerated phrase spoken on a weekend morning interview program. I assure you, I am not. But you did not merely leap ahead of the realities once, Senator. You upheld the deception for 2 continuous years, and subsequently you committed something completely distinct. And this is the exact element I desire every single individual viewing at their residences to listen to perfectly clearly. Vance finally reached downward and turned the creased sheet of paper over upon his knee. He still refrained from grasping it. He simply gazed downward at it. In March of 2017, amid a heavily broadcasted panel session, you deliberately recited unconfirmed data straight into the congressional record, Vance affirmed, his tone descending a pitch. Into the enduring archival logs of the United States Congress. You presented data sourced from a file that even the intelligence operatives who originally circulated it subsequently had to fiercely repudiate. The person serving as the main informant supplying that exact file was later charged with deceiving federal investigators. The Bureau itself had already severed its connection with the aggregator because they had internally marked him as a tremendous trustworthiness liability. He raised his stare to connect with Schiff's. You assert to be the careful individual. You are the politician who only repeats what he has physically witnessed. Yet you grabbed a thoroughly unsupported file and forever cemented it into the archival logs of the Congress, where it will endure for perpetuity merely because it conveniently matched the fabricated storyline you had already marketed to the citizenry. Vance proceeded, his rhythm utterly relaxed. And here is the element that I suspect the populace watching at home genuinely need to process for a second. When the chaos subsided, when the main informant was confronting federal indictments, when the whole file utterly collapsed beneath examination, somebody inquired you the most elementary, fundamentally basic question. A journalist inquired if you held any remorse whatsoever concerning reciting those falsehoods into the historical log, and you replied negative. You reinforced your stance. You asserted your phrasing had been accurate. You clearly declared you would repeat it all over again. He provided the space a second to internalize the absolute hubris of the position. An allegedly meticulous individual offered every imaginable chance in the universe to merely state, "I missed the mark on that one." He stared the country in the eye and stated he had absolutely nothing to express regret for. That is not what caution resembles, Senator. I do not possess the precise clinical phrase for it. But it undeniably is not caution. Nobody laughed at that remark. That declaration plunged vastly deeper than a chuckle, planting into the center of the hall where enduring verdicts are completed. He had recited an unscreened, debunked document into the enduring logs of the legislative division, the one ledger that can never be erased, simply because it confirmed a plot he had already peddled to the press 200 times. Schiff aggressively seized his mic once again. The stiff iron had restored to his stance, but there was a subtle, frantic current underneath it that had not been evident 30 minutes before. You are purposefully depicting valid congressional scrutiny as though it were a major crime, Schiff shot back. It is not an offense to execute a rigorous inquiry. It is not an offense to handle a critical national security accusation with the gravity it requires. The alternative existence, the nightmarish realm you obviously support, is one where immensely potent people are insulated from all oversight. A structure where the democratic guardian is viciously punished and the corrupt transgressor is permitted to wander away unharmed. I performed my constitutional imperative. If maintaining the structure of law has unexpectedly grown unpopular, then let it be. The historical texts are not penned by individuals who favor their own ease. I wish to offer you complete equity on that exact argument, because congressional scrutiny is an essential role, and an operating democracy needs directors ready to pose the savage queries. Vance answered steadily. Therefore, let me extend you the exact identical clemency I would desire someone would extend to me. The concluding dossier releases. It undeniably fails to prove the central accusation. A genuinely cautious individual, the precise model you continually assert you represent, is provided with a fantastic opportunity directly in that instant. He can position himself at a rostrum and announce, "I sincerely trusted the data. I relate it to the populace, but the ultimate evidence simply failed to corroborate the hypothesis, and I owe the citizens of America that clear candor." Vance halted. That is the supreme exit route. Every sincerely careful person is given one. And I actually returned and examined precisely how you managed your exit route, because I wanted to guarantee I was not misstating your conduct. He shortly looked downward at the document, still resting level, still utterly untouched. You completely bypassed it, Vance remarked. You strode straight back onto the broadcast channels and clearly informed the nation that there was plentiful evidence of the plot resting in plain sight, right after the definitive specialist whose lone directive was to expose it had notified the world that they were unable to prove it. And subsequently, when associates of your own partisan group started publicly proposing that you had pushed your position too far, you supplied a fresh rationalization. And your rationalization was not an acknowledgement of fault. Your rationalization was that the American public had merely become too accustomed to lawmakers who hide the entire reality. Vance elevated his head, his gaze acutely concentrated. You were offered the lone, elegant departure that a careful individual warrants, and you weaponized it to notify the nation that they were the genuine issue. You suggested they simply lacked the mental capability to recognize the unseen proof that you have never, not until this precise moment, succeeded in actually generating. The hall released a unified sound at that point. It absolutely was not a chuckle. It was a vastly deeper, far more deadly noise for a politician standing on a platform. It was the definitive sound of a crowd that has permanently withdrawn someone's margin of leniency. Schiff's hand spasmed toward his wrist. He stopped himself, canceled the movement, and tilted back toward the mic. That is an entirely abhorrent and deceptive misrepresentation of a profoundly complex, highly grave judicial stance. He stuttered, attempting to resurrect his former judicial cadence, but the base underneath it had utterly decayed. I never once asserted a degree of total certainty that I did not hold. I specifically declared the accusations were serious. They were serious. Acknowledging seriousness is not equivalent to carelessness. Certain of us actually invest the effort to meticulously evaluate our lexicon before we intentionally whip a whole country into a condition of factional hysteria? Certain of us definitely do, Vance responded quietly. That is the whole center of the argument this evening, is it not? Determining whether or not you fit within that classification. We are significantly past the notion of duty, Senator, Vance proceeded. His inflection was not explicitly hateful, but any hint of fabricated diplomatic friendliness had disappeared completely. What persisted was absolutely monotone, steady, and freezing. Your invocations to duty expired a considerable duration ago. Duty was the justification you deployed before your very own Chamber of Representatives officially stood up in 2023 and decided to formally reprimand you by a count of 213 to 209. A formal, monumental reprimand. The sort of harsh rebuke that the legislative branch dispenses maybe once in a whole era. And the clear phrasing deployed in that decreed that you purposefully deceived the American citizenry. He permitted the harshness of the term to hover heavily in the space. That is not me declaring that. That is not some biased broadcast host. That is the formal ruling of the exact body you continually assert you were so heroically guarding. They examined your behavior and they permanently carved your identity into their own historical logs right next to the term misled. You desire to argue the inviolability of the enduring log? You are solidified within it twofold now. Once for the unconfirmed refuse you recited into it, and once for the formal verdict they were compelled to issue against you. A deep, unified murmur shuddered through the seating arrangement, a noise much more destructive than a jeer. It is the noise a crowd produces when it finally perceives an inescapable, hideous reality regarding a public figure. And here's the specific element that I suspect the laboring class citizens, the individuals who fix our cars and construct our residences, comprehend more instinctively than anyone living in this isolated metropolis. Vance pushed forward, his amplitude never escalating. Because you stood upon this platform this evening and practically labeled them too deeply oblivious to differentiate an emotional feeling from an established truth. Thus, let us transition to a concrete truth. Only this year, journalistic inquiries expose that the cautious man, the supreme defender of verified proof, the lawmaker who constantly preaches to the working class concerning morality, is presently facing active federal investigation for supplying two completely distinct governmental agencies with two completely conflicting narratives regarding his primary domicile. Vance shook his head with sluggish, measured dismay. A real estate situated in Maryland, and another dwelling out in California. And the nucleus of the accusation is that both real estates were simultaneously designated as his primary domicile, entirely relying on which categorization acquired the more profitable monetary advantage, claiming the reduced loan percentages on one dwelling while extracting the localized tax waivers on the alternate, covering the precise same fiscal periods, authorized by the exact identical man. Two distinct houses that were both incredibly the singular location he occupied the majority of the time. The hall had reached a condition of complete frozen motionlessness. You have paraded across every significant political platform in this nation and patronizingly informed the people who repair your vehicle brakes and pour your cement bases that they are merely too naive to digest the reality, Vance proclaimed. And for the initial time, a cutting, relentless sharpness seeped into his tone. A weapon concealed just under the veneer. While those exact same individuals were dutifully executing a single, truthful mortgage paper for the lone home they genuinely rest in. You preach to this whole republic concerning the inviolability of evidence, Senator. And honestly, the nation is starting to deeply question if you have ever, even for a lone day in your existence, been compelled to adhere to the exact same metric you so aggressively require of everybody else. He had demeaned the intellect of the working class while concurrently facing accusations of deceitfully applying his signature to two distinct dwellings, asserting both were his exclusive main domicile. A subordinate legislative assistant scurried up the flank steps of the stage, traveling swiftly and remaining crouched. He leaned straight into Schiff's ear, frantically murmured a communication, and slipped a tightly creased message onto the table immediately in front of him. Schiff declined to sever eye contact to glance at it. He maintained his stare fiercely fixed upon Vance. But every single participant sitting in the initial 3 rows had glimpsed the assistant's demeanor. It was the undeniable visage of an aide dispensing disastrous information that absolutely could not wait until the recording equipment was switched off. The unread message stayed upon the desk, resting next to a cup of water that neither participant had consumed for the remainder of the night. Offer Schiff a margin of acknowledgement. Even at the grim conclusion, he declined to surrender without a struggle. He aligned his back, pulled the mic forcefully toward his lips, and discharged the absolute final piece of munitions he retained. And it was a massive one. "You desire to rest here and argue the notion of bravery?" Schiff seethed. His tone plummeted into a swift, enraged pitch, and for the initial occasion that evening, his sentiment appeared utterly, authentically real. "Let us argue it. When that specific individual held the Oval Office and purposefully sought to twist the whole machinery of the national government to satisfy his private desires, I declined to turn my gaze away. When my own colleagues in the assembly were completely frightened to even breathe his moniker in public, I marched into the center of the House chamber, and I bellowed it. They reprimanded me for my insubordination. And do you wish to understand precisely what I replied to them in retaliation? I stated to them that they had deeply exalted me with their animosity, and I meant every single syllable of it. I would happily reiterate all of it again tomorrow at dawn. You sit there, basking in a borrowed elected position that was basically gifted to you by the exact identical dictator I courageously opposed, and you possess the audacity to brand that cluelessness? I brand it the absolute sole deed I have ever executed that I was completely sure was ethically proper. I didn't hold the massive privilege of prioritizing my own secure image. I forfeited it, the entirety of it, participating in a vicious struggle that you would never have gathered the necessary bravery to even join. And it was undeniably forceful. For one brief, stunning second, it was authentically gripping partisan drama. A sliver of the vitality rebounded to his flank of the corridor. A handful of reporters temporarily ceased writing. In his concluding frantic trap, he had grasped for the lone fundamental conviction he authentically retained regarding his own record, and it possessed real emotional gravity. Vance calmly permitted him to conclude the outburst. He let the dense reverberation of the monologue completely settle throughout the space. And subsequently, Vance implemented the ultimate tactic that forever removed the restraints. His tactical tolerance dissipated, and it never resurrected. "Nobody on this stage is trying to deprive you of your individual bravery, Senator," Vance answered quietly. The crowd reflexively tilted forward in their seats to capture his speech because his amplitude had plummeted to a near murmur. "You held your position when the political gales were adversarial. I will willingly grant that argument to you in any discussion arena in America, but your individual courage is not the matter under judgment here this evening." Vance lastly extended his hand and grasped the creased page of paper. He unfolded it deliberately and positioned it entirely flat upon the compact desk separating them, aligning it facing upward so the premium resolution lenses could effortlessly zoom onto it. Printed prominently on the document was Schiff's own notorious statement, situated immediately adjacent to a single concluding phrase from the formal investigatory dossier. "What is genuinely under judgment here is exceptionally clear. You advised the American citizenry beyond 200 instances that you had directly examined the proof. The careful experts who hunted exhaustively for 2 years were unable to establish that proof was real. You purposefully recited an unscreened, partisan adversarial file into the enduring historical log. Your own parliamentary assembly officially linked your moniker to the term misled. And when the invoice for the entirety of this lastly arrived, you stared the nation in the eye and stated to them that the genuine disaster was that they were ever gullible enough to trust you in the opening place." He allowed the recap to hover in the static atmosphere. His tone stayed flawlessly steady. "You desire to converse about the core distinction between you and myself, considering you were so keen to reference my background?" Vance inquired. "I functioned as a combat journalist in Iraq. My central obligation was to record occurrences. That was the whole of the position. And the lone, unbreakable rule of that trade, the single regulation that held any true gravity, was that you never, under any situations, key a single syllable onto the page that you did not physically observe with your own 2 eyes. For what reason? Because somebody sitting back in America is going to read it. Somebody is going to rely upon it. And if you release something merely because you intensely hoped it was fact, somebody will trust it, and somebody will execute a disastrous choice grounded on your falsehood. And the guilt of that choice will linger upon your palms eternally. Vance secured gazes with Schiff, and there was a total void of hostility in his visage. That absence of wrath is exactly what rendered the blow so ruinous. I comprehended how reality functions through severe, costly tutorials. You are mandated to physically observe the proof before you publicly assert it. You stood upward here and labeled me clueless concerning the gears of truth, Senator. But that is precisely how truth operates. It has never functioned any alternate way. The concluding phrase was nearing, and everybody in the room could sense the atmospheric tension plunging directly prior to its impact. You labeled me clueless, Vance murmured smoothly. But I have never once in my existence peddled the citizens a narrative that I was unable to physically substantiate. That is the singular exhibition of genuine cluelessness occurring on this platform this evening. And it definitely is not emanating from the Marine. He had not stooped to branding him a fabricator. He had not labeled him a charlatan or a scammer. That was the nuanced genius that the media analysts would fixate upon for weeks to follow. The exact moderation that permitted the review to cut vastly deeper than any vulgar slur ever could possess. Vance had merely grabbed the politician's own 200 broadcasted vows, placed them softly upon the desk immediately adjacent to the lone, undeniable fact they could never be synchronized with, and let the two opposing realities to rest there, entirely bare. There was absolutely zero surviving argumentative twisting in the cosmos, capable of spanning the chasm between them. Adam Schiff slowly depressed his stare to the premium timepiece fastened to his left arm. He had been anxiously peering at it the whole night, the involuntary, unconscious spasm of a lawmaker who had utilized his entire vocation properly controlling the television timer. He was accustomed to simply depleting the clock, stalling until the commercial pause rescued him, leaning on the upcoming articulate passage to save him the manner it always had previously. But for the very initial instance, broadcasting live to the whole Republic, the upcoming articulate passage simply declined to form. The amusement that Vance had repressed was currently starting to rise from the crowd, inching toward the platform. It was a low, reflexive, almost sympathetic noise. Schiff's right palm wandered over to his timepiece, the automatic movement of a person desperate to latch onto the sole physical object he had remaining to command. He unfastened the steel strap. He set the timepiece downward onto the desk, immediately adjacent to the unfolded sheet of paper, as though discarding the adornment might somehow grant his shaking palms a meaningful location to sit. It did not assist. He leaned in vastly too closely to the mic, frantically seeking his brain for the start of a protective phrase. In lieu of speech, the only noise that exploded out of the hall amplifiers was a piercing, shrill shriek of electronic screeching. It carved through the stifling quiet of the space like a massive block of steel dropped onto the stone floor of an empty sanctuary. He did not utter a lone sound. Following an agonizingly prolonged wait, the host leaned inward and politely asked if the senator desired to present a concluding counter-argument. He declined to reply. That shrill sound, the shriek of feedback reverberating throughout a hall so silent you could detect a pulse, that is the precise auditory fingerprint of a partisan career instantly shifting its arc on live broadcast. By the instance the participants poured out of the auditorium exits, the video segment had already been endowed with a trending headline, and it was the sole subject monopolizing the digital sphere. A clever producer had already trimmed it into a flawless, ruinous summary reel. The 200 vows. The tranquil petition for merely one item of evidence. The savage interjection from the progressive attorney. The timepiece being sluggishly detached from the arm. Prior to midnight hitting, you were unable to browse past 3 updates on any social network platform in the nation without the clip playing automatically. And here was the foundational truth that ought to have frightened Schiff beyond anything else. The citizenry was no longer disputing foreign affairs. They were not arguing the subtleties of the probe dossier or the morality of legislative scrutiny, or any of the massive, broad systemic topics Schiff had frantically attempted to twist the night into concerning. There was absolutely nothing remaining to argue. Countless electors were merely viewing a lawmaker who had arrogantly announced, "I have witnessed the proof over 200 occasions," get requested to reveal a single item of it, and stumble dreadfully on a relentless, boundless digital cycle. The most terrible aspect? The citizenry was not even furious anymore. They were merely drained. They were finished. Out in the vast stone corridor beyond the auditorium, an investigative reporter succeeded in trapping a notable Democratic representative, an individual who had openly supported Schiff's elections on numerous times. The delegate stubbornly declined to permit his identity to be taped, and he anxiously scanned both directions of the hallway prior to whispering his admission. "We all were aware," the representative confessed quietly. "We were aware of the reality years previously. We merely justified it to our own minds by labeling it intense assurance. We feigned he was merely 10 paces forward of the remainder of the panel. But it was never assurance. A lawmaker can ultimately rebound from being factually inaccurate. But you cannot ever rebound from being demanded to present merely one solitary item of proof, locking up and sluggishly removing your timepiece." The representative disappeared down a side stairway before the reporter even possessed the time to hoist his sound-capturing device. Hundreds of miles distant, the robust man possessing the spectacles steered the prolonged, unlit journey, returning to his residence in Pennsylvania. He did not bother activating the vehicle's stereo. He simply navigated in silence, observing the luminescent markings of the highway unravel continuously into the glow of his front lamps. Somewhere directly after he traversed the state border, completely alone in the cabin of his vehicle with absolutely nobody nearby to observe it, he started to chuckle. He laughed audibly at the vivid recollection of a terrified lawmaker undoing a watch. He laughed because, for an exhausting 18 months, his household had witnessed their life reserves vanish while responding for supposed proof that nobody was ever compelled to actually reveal in the illumination of day. And this evening, airing live to the whole nation, somebody had lastly pressed that precise sort of prideful individual against the barricade and compelled him to face the repercussions. Concurrently, J.D. Vance had already implemented the traditional military departure tactic, departing the boundary without staying around to gather acclaim. He smoothly folded the printed piece of paper backward into halves, tucked it precisely into the internal pouch of his tailored coat, grasped the palms of the host and his fellow speakers, and stepped off the platform. He marched straight past the yelling media throng, past the empty seats, and past the forsaken timepiece still sitting mutely upon the desk, the exact location where the thoroughly careful individual had lastly, permanently, exhausted his words completely. He had strolled into the trap possessing nothing besides a solitary creased piece of paper hidden in his coat. He strolled outward with it still resting there.